Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of The Context. We are hosting today at a totally unique time, but with a familiar guest. So usually we're in the mornings. Today we managed to grab a little bit of David's time, so we grabbed this slot, and I'm so excited to have you all here. For those of you who don't know David Soria Parra, he's one of the founders of the MCP spec. He's been on the Context a few times with Darren and I, and we've invited him here today to talk about the upcoming release. So we're going to have a chat. We're going to get into this new stateless release, what it means, what you need to care about, what has been changing, what you might want to keep an eye on very quickly, and what you need to think about going forward as we move to a whole new approach for extensions, a bunch of services being deprecated, and a approach to handling them. So lots of change. Before we get into it, and we are going to be joined, I think, in a few minutes by Dan Delamarski, who is dialing in as well. He'll be here whenever he finds a free conference room in Anthropic's busy building. So first of all, David, super excited to have you here. Thanks for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great to be back talking to both of you. Excited for it.
Yeah, and well, maybe we just start off right at the obvious spot. This is the longest time we've had between spec changes. So congratulations, your spec is growing up. It's now not changing quite as fast. That's probably a good thing. And I think the last spec change was in November, right? So we're good. So we're good. We've got a little bit of weight to it. This is also a pretty big change. I mean, at least to my eye, it feels like a pretty significant change. What do you mean from your perspective? Maybe start us off. What do you think about when you think of this moment, like the thing everyone should know and understand? Obviously, statelessness seems to be the biggest thing people are focused on, but what's your perception of where the spec is right now and what this change really is about?
I'm curious later about Darren's perspective on the outside, but so I think the specification is, while it's the longest time between specifications, I think it is actually one of the most significant changes, and it accumulates and compresses the experiences in it, like that we had of the last 18 months with MCP into trying to find probably what is along the final shapes of, at least on the transport side things, at least hopefully the final shape, and a lot of the hard lessons learned along the way. And then as a result, I think it's probably the most substantial changes we have made to the specification, probably since adding authorization. And it's been at the same time, I think, one of the most requested and hopefully best changes we ever will make to the protocol in terms of ease of deployment, ease of use, while at the same time, and we can talk about this in a lot later into the philosophical approaches, like, could you have done this change from the beginning? Because I think that's not true. But at the same time, it's also like it makes things on the wire a bit more complicated than they used to be.
Like, how disruptive do you think this change will be? I mean,
it's a big change on the wire protocol. So if you look at the wire protocol and how things are handled, like a lot of the things that made MCP are gone. Primarily what we call the initialized sequence, which was pretty key to like how the protocol works and negotiation works. And we're heavily inspired by LSP and its initialization sequence that it has. But it is on the wire a very disruptive change. If you have your own SDK, if you build your own implementation, it's gonna be a lot of uplift to make this correct.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is the vast majority of people use the SDKs, and for that, the SDKs abstract a lot of it away. And there, it will be a very small change to no change. And we have seen this. We are implementing this internally, of course, and we're using the SDKs. And there, the changes are pretty trivial for the most part. And the complexity, and particularly the complexity around version negotiation, is mostly abstracted away.
Yeah, it's like changes like this. It's I think like historically, it's like, oh, you change the specification, it'll take forever to get adopted, all that stuff. But it's like everything's changed so much, like especially, obviously with AI, because it's like even before AI, it was like we went from like HTTP 1.1 to 2 to 3, like the jump from like 2 to 3 was so much faster from 1.1. It's like for us, the ability for us to pick up new specs and stuff like that, because the tech is consolidated, just a couple touch points or whatever. So I don't really think, because I was thinking about, it's like, well, most of the SDKs, pretty much everyone uses one of those SDKs, and they're really, really good. All of them are really high quality. But then I was thinking about like, oh, what about like, like a lot of times people just do like little like curl and stuff like that. Like AI will just do like, oh, instead of just hitting, like using an SDK, it just does curl. But it's like, it's like AI will learn it really quickly too. Yeah. So I don't suspect that this is going to be like as disruptive as like I would think, because from our practice, or like in practice, what we're seeing is it's not like most people perfectly follow the protocol anyways. Yeah. So it's like it's kind of par for the course of like things being a little bit off. But
I'm a bit worried about like there are certain combinations of like modern clients and legacy servers where you need to fall back based on error codes because the protocol wasn't as, like, you always think about protocol design as future proofing for exactly that reason. Yeah. Of like what happens if I have to make a change. And some of the things we did not think perfect, like we did not anticipate fully. And there it's a bit painful and I'm a bit worried, but I think you're right, Darren. Like these type of changes, like 5 years ago before AI, you would be way more careful and make them way more like smaller and more like maybe more granular. Where here, both with the SDKs, but also with the models being so strong, like making these changes is really, hopefully not that much of a deal.
Because it's interesting, because like when we deploy MCP or whatever, like because I'm fooling around with kind of doing like agents and sandboxes, and we already have an MCP platform. That's kind of like what our business does or whatever. But like we kind of already make the assumption that a lot of the clients, like we don't really know what the clients support, what they don't support or whatever. So we already kind of put a shim in there anyways of like, so it's like we compensate for the clients. So it's like, but I see that it's kind of like, a lot of the places where MCP is getting integrated anyways into like applications, whatnot, it's like, it's already kind of like a robust integration that by the time it gets to the thing that's consuming it, it doesn't really change. It's still just like a tool call, So, but, so I think, so it's kind of curious of like, so, I mean, how do you feel about the fact that like, you lost the essence of kind of like what an MCP was, this like JSON RPC, LSP inspired thing. And now it's like, well, it's kind of like, why didn't you just do HTTP in the beginning? Like what are those type of things?
I think that's a fair thing to say. The most projects in the world, I think they start at that point, and then they evolve depending on the needs into a different direction. Like when we started MCP, it was mostly a local thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's a very different beast if you like. In a local environment, you never get rid of initialize because it's completely viable and it's completely sensible in a way. But in the remote scenario, which came later, there is this aspect to that. And now you have an interesting point where could you make it HTTP? To some degree, maybe, but there's still a little bit of this, like what we call multi-round trip stuff, that is this additional semantics, where, actually, an HTTP request does not have a good notion of you send a request and you require additional information to fulfill this request. You can do it to some degree, but even like an open API spec does not have a good notion around how do you encapsulate this in a specific instance? How do you communicate this? And there are some ways in HTTP to announce this, but there's still additional semantics required. And this is the key part that we now have in a way. The JSON RPC as an envelope, I guess at this point, okay, there's metadata that flows, which is kind of useful. There's version negotiation. But in the end of the day, it kind of evolved to like a more like a REST API thing with a bit of additional semantics that are useful.
Yeah,
that's what it is, and that's not a bad state to be. But I think the details of these additional semantics are actually meaningful.
Yeah.
Maybe for people who aren't as familiar with the release, we should take a step, one step up. So start with this. This release is killing sessions. It's moving to statelessness. Why? Like, what's the reasoning? Why are we doing this now? What was the, and what do you think just what do people need to do to take account of this if they've built MCP? So it sounds like from you're saying just use the SDKs. They're going to handle most of the complexity, but maybe just explain the why. I think the why is important for people to understand.
Yeah, I think there's two whys. There's on one hand side, if you try to run MCP servers at scale, there is a problem that when you are doing initialize, you're fundamentally starting some form of session between the client and the server. First, the notion of what that session entails was somewhat underspecified, and that caused issues. The second notion to that is when you then need additional data like elicitations or other things, routing them to the right servers is quite complicated and complex. And so you needed to, under the hood, either do sticky routing, which kills your optimizations for distributed system serving, or you need to serialize the state to a database and then be able to catch up. And that's complex architecture and has its other problems. And certain providers like Cloudflare somewhat solve this between durable objects and others, but even that there's a certain level of flimsiness. That's one aspect. The third aspect to all of this is when you actually look in production, the way MCP servers are used, they're usually fire and forget. So they're initialize, send a tool call, stop, initialize, stop, right? Or initialize, don't send a tool call, and then stop. With the result that the average traffic pattern that we've seen is 70% initialize. And that's not that's data that flows that is not needed, right? And so a lot of the lessons learned in scalable serving were tricky to implement with MCP. It had benefits in a way because there were things like elicitations out of band and a bunch of other use cases that we initially, or sampling, for example, I think sampling was a big one that we initially thought was useful, turned out to not be as widely used and not be as useful. And the session aspect was not as prominent as we hoped it was. And as you're seeing what's actively used in the protocol, you can narrow down to what you're actually optimizing. And at the end of the day, what we're optimizing to is tool calls, resources, and elicitations are the three main pillars in the end of the day that I think matters to people at the moment. Yeah. And everything else, prompt, logging, all these additional things that to some degree might have required some of the out-of-band stuff are kind of gone. Mm-hmm. And then even elicitations, we narrowed it down to you can only do it during tool calls or during a call like a research read.
Yeah.
So
go ahead, Jan.
Well, I was just going to ask then. So the previous approach, very much heavy on sessions, initialization. The new approach, I'm guessing it's giving that it's stateless. I can run this just like any web service, any API, effectively. I just sort of put it behind a load balancer and scale up based on demand. And
yeah, that's exactly.
That's going to be. I'm sure that's very exciting for the operators and infrastructure providers who have to kind of deal with the scaling of sessions.
Because the thing what you would see in practice, a lot of times people basically, they would deploy it that way in a way that could, horizontally scale or whatever, but they weren't really respecting the protocol. So it was it didn't actually work the complete way that it was supposed to or whatever. So it's never been super, super difficult to deploy MCP servers unless you actually want to do it 100% correct. That's what, so it's if you just ignore certain parts, because there was a lot of fuzziness in the spec. It's you don't have to do that, and so people just don't do that, and then you could deploy it.
You won't be surprised how many MCP servers are very happy to respond without an initialized sequence.
Yeah. That's the reality, because that's what you see is a lot of them. They're just initialize responds with the same thing, and then the tool call, so they don't really care. It's they're just trying to satisfy the client behavior.
Right. But you also have the maturity at some point. I'm going to be like, okay, well, if that's everybody, nobody's using it that way. Well, just cut it out and like.
Yeah. Well, so that's the thing is, it's like, so this whole stateful thing, it's like, like in the beginning when it's, a lot of the discussions around dropping or, going to stateless, like I was very opposed to it. I didn't like it. But the thing was, like at the time, I was very much wanting to like push, it's like I was using the spec to its fullest, all the features. I'm like, oh, there's like sampling is really cool. There's all these things that was really interesting, like exploring using all those features. So it's like once you start, kind of going to a completely it's like I was concerned about like, it's kind of like losing the essence of what, it's like, what is this protocol? And then we're already trying to like optimize it to, for production, not production, but like hyperscalers or something like that. But now that here we are, like a year or 2 years later, no, it hasn't been 2 years, has it? I don't think we've even reached
almost 1.5. Yeah,
1.5 years. Yeah, it's like that's a lifetime.
No, like way longer.
Yeah. So it's like now we are like 18 months in, and you see how it's actually used and stuff like this. Like this is a very reasonable change. It's like this is kind of it makes sense. It's like and it's kind of nice to a certain point, like admit it's like, okay, well, these different little features, things that we thought were going to be, great ideas or whatever. It's like, no, tool calling, like that's kind of the essence of what this is. And we just need to make that like, incredibly strong and whatnot. So it's like, a year ago, I would have been so opposed to this, but at this point, it's like, oh no, this is good. It's like, it just simplifies it. It's much easier.
I absolutely agree, Darren. Like in a year ago, I was very opposed to these kind of changes.
Yeah.
Came up with this, and I'm like, no, I still believe there's usefulness. But at some point, you're absolutely right. And at some point, you're just going to be like, no, let's not be dogmatic about it. Just be realistic about like how people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, like, because some people still like stupidly on the internet will like make comments about like MCP like being dead or something like that or whatever, but it's like absolutely not. Like we all know, the amount of like how much MCP is being used, where it's kind of like this protocol, which is largely for tool calling or whatever. It's like I'd say it's pretty much like a mass. It's like it's a success. It's it is the foundation of like tool calling, and it's going to be the continue to be this widely adopted thing. So it's kind of like, it's like, well, that was really good. Like how greedy you need to get, like how many more features? Like, no, we need to do this. And it's like, well, you had like a smash hit here with this one.
Exactly.
So,
and to be fair, I think there's like, if you go to the mechanics, we should talk about some of the mechanics what we're doing now under the hood, because I do think that, and I do want to give credit here, because a lot of it's the Google and the Microsoft folks that came up with this multi-round trip requesting. I think it's a very, very useful and smart way to go like, hey, we still want to support elicitation. But elicitations is actually like, well, not every client supports it. We're getting asked about this a lot because people really want the security to like, oh, I really want to ask the user for it being okay to like let me like use this tool and not have to rely on like hoping that the client like asks about a tool use or not. You have a lot of these instances, but now when you have these multi-round trip things, which I think is really smart, is like originally you had this issue if you want to serve MCP stateless. Well, how do you like during a tool call for an elicitation, like how do you know you need to go back to the original server in order, because it's the one that holds the state. But now what we're doing, we're just basically appending that state to the request, very much like the messages API appends stuff at the end of the day, whole state. And so we're just appending the request. We're sending the tool request. The tool request goes like, no, wait, I need input required. By the way, here's an elicitation. You go answer that. And then the client goes like, oh, I have all of that. Let me send the original request plus the additional elicitation. And then another server goes like, oh, I have a new request. Oh, this is a tool call with an elicitation. Oh, great. This seems to answer all the questions I will ever need. And then it just goes. And I think that's, it's a very smart and nice way to just move basically the state away from the server onto the wire protocol and hope that bandwidth is for free.
It is, unless you're in AWS.
Exactly.
So, okay, when we think about this new, if I'm in production today, what's the first thing to check? Are there any hidden things I should be worried about? Do you expect people to trip over this, or do you think that this really will be, relatively easily handled? Like, I'm not.
As one of the modern SDKs, the most recent version of the case, I would not be worried. I would be worried if you use a 6-month-old version of the SDK. You should upgrade the SDK. You need to make sure if you implement your own thing, the most important part is the version negotiation piece. There's a very lengthy description in the specification that has a nice table that has a good set of like 2, 4, 6, 7 rows that tells you all the different combination of old and new servers and what you need to do in which instance. And that's the complicated piece that the SDKs move away from you. And then the rest is actually quite trivial. The rest has not changed much. There's a bit more data in the metadata that comes flowing. But beyond that, for the most part, that's the key piece. And then you just leave away basically initialization. And that's it for the most part. But in the end of the day, it really boils down, use a modern SDK. Otherwise, if you try to do it yourself, it can get tricky. And why you use the modern SDKs? Because they use conformance tests, which we have implemented over the last 6 months, very painstakingly, that test server and client implementation against a set of like rules, how it must be implemented. And that gives you more of a safeguard of like these things are actually as intended.
It's interesting if you go to the MCP website or whatever. So the SDKs, they're actually tiered now. So there's like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 of like what's their conformance, and basically how many are? I was just looking to see how many there are now.
There's a lot of them. There's a lot of SDKs, yeah. I love that you're bringing it up. I thought we have done this because we have done this in January, February, and it's such a good thing to think about, like, what is the guarantees an SDK gives to you? Do you, Darren, you want to talk about tiering? Like,
but I was curious when you did this release or whatever, is like, what does the spec release look like when you roll it out with like the SDKs? Do you guys like, is there a process of making sure the SDKs are like up to date, or they're testing it out or everything?
There is, and I wonder if there's a way for me, because I think I can actually look at this.
Why don't you share your screen while I introduce Den, David? So, hey Den, welcome. Hey, folks. Glad you found a nice quiet spot somewhere to join us. We have been chatting for the last 20 minutes or so about statelessness. Actually, we've been kind of dove into that for really, I don't think we've gotten any further than that. So that is our passion at the moment. But we were just talking about the SDKs. And for anyone who doesn't know Den in the MCP community, you definitely haven't been here long. He is at the heart of the community. His LinkedIn posts are one of my favorite things every day or two when he puts them in. They tend to be full of great information. So if you're not following him, you should be. But Den also works at Anthropic as of earlier this year, I think he joined, and he really is one of the key maintainers and people keeping this project alive. So Den, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I am glad that my LinkedIn posting is what made me famous.
Well, famous, at least to me. All right, David, I see you've got your stuff up.
Yeah, because this is something that Dan actually built, and I think it shows a little bit more that we also matured in the way we're doing the releases quite significantly. So we have been looking into this release much earlier of like making sure that, because tier 1 SDKs have these guarantees that they need to adhere to, which is that on the day of the release, they must support the new specification. So if you're a tier 1 SDK, if you wanted to go the C# Python TypeScript SDK, and you pick it up on July 28th this month, you will get the new specification ready to go. And part of that means that we need to give them time and need to give them have them input into the process. And so we had a much stricter release process this time around, where we're locking the list of the changes that we're allowing in earlier, working through the finalization of it, making an RC candidate, and then have the SDK maintainers go implement this, and then like as of yesterday, or maybe we need to do this today, the SDK maintainers need to effectively sign off and say, look, we're done. This release is good to go from our end. We have not found in the implementation phase major bugs, because if you look at things from the abstract in building, and Darren knows better than anybody else, is like implementing, like defining something, implementing are two very different things, and you find a lot of detailed problems in implementing things that you would not catch in defining. And so we have this like clear, like, okay, our SDK maintainers get final input. Is this right? Is this wrong? And then we as the client maintainer sign off some of the key clients that we have, and then we're going to release. So the SDKs are actually, most of them have beta versions already out with the new release in, just to make sure that we just have this like soaking period where things can finalize and get better. We're still not perfect on the release process because we skipped it. We pushed it a little bit further back than we originally intended, but we're getting more mature in the release process. And part of Darren's point is like giving SDK maintainers a chance to implement this end to end, test it, have clients support it from day one. And that's part of the work we're doing at the moment.
Do you actually have like a conformance suite now? Like something that people, and then I'm just curious, is it all written by AI? The conformance suite? Did you?
Dan, is it all written by AI?
So
I mean, look, like let's be transparent. Like we're using Claude a lot in our work.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's a bad thing. So this is keep going. Yeah.
No, but like realistically, it's one of those things where we see that there's a lot of boilerplate and reusable stuff that would be super helpful to use AI tools for, but there's always a human in the loop. So we've been collaborating very closely. Like Paul has been driving on our team the conformance suite and the conformance test, and he's been putting a lot of great care to make sure that it actually works properly. So it's not fully handed off, but there's certainly, we're trying to experiment more with a lot of these tools. And you'll see also, by the way, that full transparency, like if you look at the MCP repository, we're using tools like Claude Tag to go and scan the spec and make sure that we're not missing anything.
Yeah, like, I mean, I don't think this is a bad thing. So it's like when you get into like this stuff of like kind of all this like process and, conformance and specification, I mean, maybe since you guys created this, you love this stuff. I can't stand like, it's like, I just want to program code and whatnot. But what I find with AI is like, it makes all of this stuff so much better. And so, so it's like, so something like that, like the conformance test or whatever, it's like, it's very hard to create those type of things. And before, I mean, I remember back in the day with like Java or something like that, it's like, you'd have to pay a lot of money to get the conformance suite to then, to run it, to certify your thing. And like that, maybe they're just greedy and that's why they did it. But like now we can legitimately just do those things and get the benefit of like, no, it is legitimately, conforms to, and Claude does, Claude and whatever the other models, but it does an incredibly good job at like, programming for corner cases and weird bugs and whatnot or whatever. So it's like, this I think is a perfect use case of like, just generate, you can port, Bun to Rust. I'm sure you can create a conformance suite.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100% spot on there. Like, I have yet to see people who are genuinely excited about writing yet another conformance test suite in their life. Right?
Yeah.
So it definitely helps to have models help you with that.
Yeah. I'll also add that there is a good degree of work that we're doing because MCP has matured now. We have a huge surface area. It helps when, we have tools like Claude that we can use to scan the entire surface area and find things like inconsistencies. Maybe we did not mention something about a security constraint that we put in the SEP, but it's not necessarily yet in the specification document. And that is actually a superpower that allows us to scale very easily to make sure that this spec actually represents the end-to-end of our decisions, so that you see in the actual published spec is reflective of what we across the core maintainers and the maintainers were deciding for it. And again, I use these tools all the time because it makes life so much easier. So like David and I can focus on the actual spec, kind of the content, instead of a lot of the logisticals. Like, well, did we put the security constraint of the security doc in this particular spot where we documented it before?
And every now and then you need to shepherd Claude into stop talking and doing a bit less.
Of course, yeah.
But
So there was a bunch of deprecation.
yet again, the same like 5 things over and over again, and it could be a link. Stop it.
It is a load-bearing claim.
Yeah. I did want to ask about some of the stuff that got deprecated, because I think you deprecated in this one sampling, logging, roots. I mean, these are obviously still around and people can still use them for the next year or so until they actually disappear. But pretty, some of these were pretty exciting things when we brought them into the spec a year ago only. In the case of like sampling, I want to say it was about a year and a half ago. What was the thinking behind these? Anything that you had real consternation over, David? And where do you think?
Sampling still hurts. I love it. I will never not love it. Here, look, logging. I think nobody really actively uses. I think in the local only world, I think that would have made to some degree some sense. In scenarios where you want to like MCP server stuff show up in the logs of the host, that's fine. Roots, I think, is good initially, but it's again like a very niche thing. There are servers that use it, and so but it's a very niche thing that is basically mostly for IDEs. And maybe we keep it, maybe we don't. But in the end of the day, these are reductions that are like back to, I think, Darren's point of like, we're widened the surface to the things we thought were useful and we're mindful about it, but we also like realistic about like narrowing down to the good pieces that everybody is actively using. Sampling, there's 2 things to sampling. Sampling, I think, would need a massive overhaul in how it's done, because it is just very limiting and has very confusing semantics at certain pieces, like this server and all servers, whatever it was. There was a very confusing concept in there that was probably not perfectly thought through, and it made a lot of things difficult. The lack of initially supporting tools was a problem, and then by the time sampling got in a reasonable shape, and not perfect shape, but in a reasonable shape, any pushing we've tried to do were kind of like really hard for clients to go and really implement this. And it's particularly hard for clients to implement it in a remote scenario. And I think what we're seeing is that MCP is moving away from a local first thing to being increasingly more remote, to the point where I'm like, maybe we should just speak HTTP over standard IO to facilitate a bunch of like, remove a bunch of the complexities we have. And in the remote world, sampling is not really good because you're just more inclined to just bring an SDK and run your own inference, instead of having to hope that the client accepts you doing the inference on their side, which most clients refuse to. I think it's a different story in the local story, but in the end of the day, it boils down to like, is it conceptually the right thing to have sampling? Probably. Is it realist? Is it additional complexity that effectively nobody's using? Probably. And so, in the end,
so I mean, when you think about, because sampling, it's to actually do the real AI, the completion or whatever. Whereas like you think it's like, well, it was hard enough to just agree on RPC tool calling, and to just that basics of like how much do you really need to take on when like, because one of the things I've always bugs me, still drives me nuts today, is like, why have we not come to a standardization on like a messages API or a responses API? But if you watch, it's like we kind of have we have 3 dominant, chat completions, responses, and messages. Like those are the 3 dominant APIs. But I mean, Google still has their own. It's like people, they keep changing these things, and for good reason or whatever. There's like, there's still kind of innovation to be had. So it's just not a settled enough space of like, what should that common shape of like what completions or sampling or whatever should look like. But I thought it was really interesting that you said that, like, about remote is like, that's what we're kind of seeing, is that like the real strong advantage of MCP is actually remote. That's the case where it's like that's why people are like, because everyone loves Claude Code and CLIs and all this stuff, and they're like, oh, everything be a CLI, and it's like, no, you don't understand. That's just not feasible for so many things. And so, like, if you don't do like CLI or just roll your own code, like MCP is really the only choice for remote. It's like only reasonable. So I find it somewhat ironic where it's like, oh, MCP was started as a local only type thing. Remote came later, but remote is really the sticking point of like, that's what's really gonna MCP. So
that is and you're absolutely right. Like, you're absolutely right. When you already have a local server, you have already an execution environment locally. At that point, you might as well use a CLI.
Yeah.
That's another aspect to this whole piece. The models got significantly better at a lot of things, which had the result that like certain aspects that MCP used to be good at are now captured by CLIs in a good, reasonable way, and that's why remote is more important for MCP. And then back to sampling, for example, as the models get better and had more complexity to them, the shape of the APIs got bigger, and you just could not catch up, to Darren's point, to find a unified shape across these things. And so you were always bound to be very limited as a server developer if you would want to rely on sampling. And at the same time, if you are remote, you can just bring an SDK and take 100% of the surface of a model instead of like in the capabilities of a model. And we don't have to worry about like how do you represent thinking tokens or scales or other things on this shape.
And folks often forget the fact that there's a lot of clients that are not running on a desktop. You have web clients, you have mobile clients that need to talk to MCP, where spinning up new computer environments is just not feasible. Or, you could do this, of course, like everything can be done with the magic of software, but it becomes very expensive and very complex very fast, instead of you just having an endpoint that you can have standard like 2 calls from. That's it.
Yeah, it's also like, it's a bit like, desktop software versus like web software, right? Like you can deploy these things better, you can update these things better if they're remote. You don't have to deal with like an MDM type of like deployment issue of like, how do I deploy this one CLI to 10,000 people, right? Yeah. It's a great opportunity if you're like a local developer on Cloud Code and like that's all you care about. It's not so great if you're trying to deploy MCP, like deploy connectivity to like knowledge worker inside a big company.
It's we tend to think that like there's like, oh, there's going to be like one answer or one solution to all this, and it's like AI is such a massive domain and we've only begun or whatever, where it's like there's just a lot of room for a lot of different approaches and whatnot. So it's like it's not a zero-sum game. And I mean, that's something I've kind of appreciated a lot more over, as we continue to evolve of like, the way people would write agents or whatnot. I'd always look at things and be like, oh, that's stupid. Like you shouldn't do it that way. But then like come to appreciate like, oh no, like it works fine in that domain, but then like it doesn't work fine in this domain. So it's like, it just all depends. So it's like AI, it's kind of like saying there's like one way to, I don't know, like
use a processor.
Yeah, right. Because that's literally what it is. It's like we have like, before we had a CPU, now we have this AI, GPUs, but like AI thing. So it's like, it's just going to be tons and tons of different ways of doing this.
Yeah, the same way, like there's desktop software and there's web-based software, and web-based software has a useful point, but then there's still things that you want to run as desktop software. There's a lot of like, it's never a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Darren being very nuanced here.
Yeah. It's very surprising to me as well. I don't know what happened. In the water in Arizona this week.
I took my meds before we started.
I have no idea. Okay, so one other big change with this is the introduction of extensions. You guys, I think the first extensions are going to be MCP Apps and Tasks, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe Dan, you can tell us a little bit about how this came to be. Like, where did the decision come from to move to extensions? Do you see a long line of extensions? Somebody in the community was just asking, do you expect domain-specific protocols or extensions to emerge alongside MCP? So what made you guys decide to implement extensions? Why these two as your first couple? And where do you see it going?
And Enterprise Managed Auth, which by the way, launched just not too long ago. I think the extensions are a model for us to really test out things in the protocol before we bake them into the protocol. Because MCP picked up so much traction in the industry, anything that we put into the core of the protocol itself becomes very embedded in a lot of the ecosystems that are built around like AI and agentic tooling. So naturally, if we put something in the protocol and then, in a year or 6 months, we come back and say, actually, scratch that, all of that is going to be gone, that's going to become very unsustainable very quickly. So extensions are a good way for us to pilot things and see how the community adoption is driven for those. So like a good example here is MCP Apps, right? Like the MCP Apps is one of the official extensions that actually is kind of bundled in the release of the protocol, but in and of itself, like we released it out of band. Like they're not versioned the same way as the protocol. They're shipping kind of updates separately, but it's a good vehicle to test those changes. So like MCP Apps, we launched, and then we see how the community at large is adopting them, which clients build it, like what are the rough edges that we might need to polish up. And generally, like it is entirely possible for an extension to long-term maybe make it into the protocol, but it helps us gauge this industry interest and the mechanism by which those are adopted, right? There's other extensions that are on deck right now. Things like, for example, for like authorization, we have DPOP, demonstrate proof of possession, or workload identity federation. We don't know yet to what extent is going to be broadly adopted by the industry in terms of MCP use specifically. But if they're extensions, it's very easy for us to ship, work with specific clients, implement them, and then test drive it and see, like, does this fit with what we're trying to build into the shape of the protocol, and then potentially graduate them in the future. So definitely something that I think it was driven by community interest, by contributor interest. We see a lot of folks that want to build new capabilities, but we're trying to be very, very calculated and careful as to what makes it into the core protocol, because it would be very expensive and unwieldy to manage this at scale if we have to basically constantly reassemble the protocol with every new release. I don't know if David has any more context on that.
Yeah, there's two things, right? There's the extensions are serving two things. The one is there's domains where the universality of the protocol doesn't fit that specific domain only, like MCP Apps is one of them. You effectively need a web renderer. So this does not apply to terminals, and so this needs to be an extension. And then there's this is experimental stuff that we need to get right, and then we put it and then we either want to keep it optionally or we want to put it in the protocol. Task is one of the things. We put it experimental. I think the initial version wasn't great. We redesigned it. So now it's an extension, and see that it soaks there for a while before we put it probably into the protocol. On the other hand side, skills over MCP, for example, which I'm very excited about, I think it's one of the cooler things to do, is probably more like an optional thing because it's a pattern on top of MCP. And so that fits more like the MCP apps use case. And so there's these two distinct use cases. That's really the main reason. We still have to learn if this works. It's an approach. For MCP apps, it has worked. I think for skills over MCP, it will work. For tasks, we will see if it will work. As for these, like where it needs to soak. And the other one that will come down in a similar vein is like the trigger/events, where you basically allow webhooks to trigger MCP clients from an MCP server. Webhooks is one way. There's other ways as well to effectively like be more proactive and like let the client know that you have an update on a certain thing. And I think those are helpful things. And extensions will be a way for us to understand how widely used they will be and if they should be part of the core protocol or not.
So one thing I think, so have you guys talked at all between like you got like MCP and ACP? Because ACP did just join the Linux Foundation, right? Is it in AIF or I don't know, but because like the thing I find interesting is like all of this stuff. I mean, it's like, you know, like you just did the enterprise OAuth, and I don't know, that's like the third major revision on auth. You're doing stateless versus stateless, all these things where it's like you spent so much time with this transport layer. And I noticed something else kind of interesting was I was vibe coding some stuff against ACP, and I just told the Claude like, oh, use the MCP SDK because that has the lower transport, and then it could program to it. So I do wonder, like, because there's a couple project, I've seen quite a few AI projects adopt this like JSON RPC type thing, where it's like, how much of like this kind of just the lower transport, not even so much the message shape, but just all the learnings you've done of like, can we share that among these other protocols?
Yeah, extensions have this, like there's definitely the idea. I think that's a good point. I'm completely happy if an ACP is technically an extension on top of MCP. It's completely fine. There's a difference for us between what we call official extensions and unofficial ones. And the only difference is like who maintains it. Is it part of the MCP project or not? And that's just to like, if I don't know, if I don't have any governance over an extension that I'm not sure I want to advertise it as like an official thing and like put my name to it. But that's to the extent to it. And I'm very happy, and it should be completely possible for a lot of these projects to build on top of MCP and this like transport layer, and just use it. And that's completely cool. And I hope there will be more unofficial extensions that do this kind of stuff.
I think it's a very, very important point that folks should not miss, is the fact that like while extensions themselves, like we have a number of them that are official, the new spec actually codifies how unofficial extensions can launch and what are the conventions they can follow. So if somebody wants to build a custom extension for maybe a specific like industry type auth thing that nobody else uses, they can absolutely build this and then integrate into their clients. And there's a standard interop way to work on top of MCP. So it's a path that we very, very deliberately paved to make sure that folks have that avenue if things are not embedded directly in the spec, right? So like if you're trying to like put like an SCP, a spec enhancement proposal, and then you realize like, well, seems like the contributors do not want this in the spec, like you can absolutely build an extension for that. And that's a very valid track to go and pursue.
So now that we're here, right, we're coming up on this release, you guys must be starting the process of thinking about what's next. Do you think the cadence is going to look like this going forward? Do you think we're going to be seeing, 9 to 12 months between releases become maybe the right, or every 6 months? Like what's your kind of target for how often you want this to change? Because I think broadly people are pretty happy with the length of time it continuing to expand from what I've heard from people consuming it. I'm just curious what your guys' thoughts are.
What is the cadence I need to do so Darren doesn't show up in front of my door with being grumpy about it?
That's less time. Unfortunately, that's less time usually.
We probably want to aim for something like 6 months at the moment, maybe slower. That's what we're trying to do. I think we want to be a bit slower over time, but as needed. But the space is still moving fast. Everything slower than 6 months feels too slow. Everything faster feels too fast. It seems to be like the right amount of change that people are okay absorbing at the time. But at the same time, I'm very aware that the willingness to change infrastructure pieces, like an MCP implementation, depends on the attention that the project has in the industry, because you're like more prone to focus on the things that are new and that are exciting. And as MCP becomes less exciting and more table stakes, the more annoying it becomes if you have to update it. And so you need to, so there's an aspect there where we understand that it will take a bit, that we will be slower, just per virtue that I think the willingness to change in the industry for what becomes a core layer will be lower. And at the same time, as like the protocol is really, really widespread now, it means more pieces need to update. And so we're just trying to be a bit slower and more intentional about it.
Do you have things kind of already in the pipeline for the next spec? Like, do you have some major things you're looking at? A new version of OAuth 3, maybe?
No, I thought I'd change the transport layer one more time, Darren. We have some things lined up. I think the skills over MCP extension, I think, is the big one. Everything will most of them will come via extensions. And then I think the triggers one and the events one, I think those are the really big ones, because they enable us a set of new use cases that I think are really exciting. And then beyond that, I really want to finalize task into a spot where maybe it's ready to be part of the core protocol. And maybe and I hope maybe we can get this done at like Task's first birthday. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've been interested in, and this is kind of above the MCP spec or whatever, is the idea of kind of trying to standardize on certain tool shapes. Because like the thing that you see is like the models, the models get trained on these like the shape of these tools or whatever, and most of the harnesses are like settling on certain shapes of tools or whatever. So it's like something like tool search, is like an extremely powerful thing now. The idea that if you train the models, the idea they can search for tools and then use them and whatever is like. I mean, do you think there's any chance of doing kind of trying to actually come up with any kind of interface specifications within the kind of like the MCP umbrella?
Probably to some degree, not in the abstract, but in like the specifics of like people asking for some form of like progressive discovery within the protocol as a high-level primitive that might look like tool search or something along those lines. And there might be a chance of doing that. Tool search is a tricky one because not every API supports it, for example. Mm-hmm. Google. And so there's tricky bit there. But are you looking for tool search in particular?
No, so not even specifically like, I'm not saying like new methods on MCP, but actually the shapes of the tools. Like, so like the tool call, the schemas of them, mm-hmm. Because it's like, every single harness has a bash tool. Like they all have like, so it's like there's ones that become super, because one of the things that like I wonder about with these models or whatever is like you train them so much on these tools that at some point, if you see a tool called bash, does the description matter anymore? You know exactly what it is, Mm-hmm. So it's like if there's, a common understanding of what these specific tools are, then we can kind of optimize the tokens and whatnot, because like over time we've just figured out, it's like, well, yeah, it's like, how many ways can you do like cat, something like a very, basic tool that,
you would like to see like a library that that you understand on each side, and you just save the schema definition, and you have like a common understanding effectively.
Yeah, because it's just that it's just like, because as soon as we all like, because I think it's interesting, it's like with skills, for example, like when skills came out, like I mean, like everything, I just thought it was stupid when it came out, where it was just like, well, what's the point? It's just like a README with pointers to other READMEs. And then the idea that you like call a tool to then invoke the skill, like it all seemed weird to me, right? But the models are trained on it now. So even it doesn't really matter if the mechanism was kind of weird to like activate a skill through a tool call or whatever. It's like, they're just trained to do that. So it's like, we all kind of agreed on, this pattern I thought was strange, but now that becomes the pattern. So it's like, it's just the thing is like, if you come up with these kind of interfaces for what tools, and we just kind of all commonly agree, then all the models get trained on it. And then I think the models will be even more efficient and way better. And then you'll see like, like lower end models and stuff being much better at tool calling and whatnot. Because I always think like the long description to the bash tool, at this point, it's got to be useless. Like you could probably remove that from like Claude code and be like, yeah, you've been trained enough. You know what a bash tool is,
No, I agree.
So
as we get, I want to be mindful of time. We're going to run out of time in a couple of minutes. Dan, you've worked with a lot of the teams I know really closely, David as well. What anyone you want to point out for the hard work on this one? Carrying a lot of water and patching a lot of issues.
I mean, look, shipping something this big and this deeply integrated into the industry, I think takes a village, no matter how you slice it. We had contributors of all walks for this release. Obviously, we have your kind of usual suspects, which are like the core maintainers that have done a lot of work, and like Katie and Curtis have been like shaping a lot of the transport stuff. But beyond that, like every single SDK, think of like how many SDKs we ship. We've had like excellent engagement from every single SDK maintainer, whether it's Java, Rust, C#, Go, Swift. Like a lot of these are not possible without an actual community building that stuff out. We had a lot of folks that helped review SCPs. Like if you look at the GitHub discussions and how many people had opinions, we have folks that are chiming in Discord. Like if I would say, like, there's easily just like dozens of people that actively contributed to the spec. So it's probably going to take another hour naming everybody, but I just want to call out the fact that, like, it's definitely one of those efforts that spanned both people, companies, clients, all sorts of partnerships that have existed probably like in a way that, like, before MCP was a thing. If you told me that we partner with the companies, that we partner with the industry at large, you'd be like, yeah, that's not possible. Like, how do you all get them all under the same roof? But somehow, like, we're pulling them together. And actually, like, massive kudos to David, who helped kind of corral some of this stuff. And I mean, like, MCP makes it possible to kind of bring everybody together.
I think that's been from the start. David said that, that inclusiveness was there very early, and it's been a hallmark of the project.
If anything, like, and Darren probably agrees with that, hopefully, but like, while the protocol might not be perfect and has its flaws, I think that the thing that it has achieved, like, the thing that is actually that people don't see, I think, is the biggest achievement of the project is to get all these people on the same table and talk and do something together. I think that's actually the bigger achievement than the underlying mechanics of as useful as it is.
Yeah. Well, guys, with all of that, I think we should probably wrap. Either of you going to be joining any of the upcoming dev summits happening out in Asia? I know we have Japan and Korea, China. Den, looks like you're nodding your head. You're going to at least one or two?
I'm nodding. I'm going to Korea.
Oh, Korea. All right. Den's in Korea. I'm in China and Japan. David, you at any of the events in Asia?
I'm in Japan.
Japan. All right. Well, let's get some sushi, man.
Darren, how about you? Are you going to any of them?
Nope.
I'm like, come on, Darren. It's Japan. Why wouldn't you come to go talk MCP in Japan? I've still got a couple weeks. We'll see. David might get there.
Are you going to Amsterdam, any of you?
Oh yeah, I'll be in Amsterdam for sure. I think, Darren, are you coming to Amsterdam?
No, that's the one in September. No, October.
Yeah,
October
is San Jose.
You gotta go to that one, Darren. You have to go to that one. You're not.
I think I have no excuse for the San Jose one. That's just a 2-hour flight that way. I can fly there and come back on the same day. Just sleep at home. Yeah.
I'm gonna fly and pick you up, man.
Yeah.
All right. Well, guys, congratulations. Exceptional work making this community happen. You guys have done an incredible job on the release. You've done an incredible job hearing so many voices and bringing them all together. I've said it a million times, but thank you for running this in a way that is truly open and contributing it to AIF. And everyone out there, if you're not following Den everywhere he is, or at least one place he is, you're probably not staying up to speed. I could just repost
David. Don't forget that David's there.
David is fine. David is fine, but this is not the same. It's not the same.
It's not close to be the same. Like,
not the same.
Ben has the influencer gene, man.
No, influence on LinkedIn. David got Twitter.
Sure.
David on Twitter. I just learned being half a decent troll like Darren. Like, that's all I do.
The key, just troll. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for being here today. It was awesome, and congratulations again. Fantastic release.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Take care.
Bye.